Friends, after discussing the figure of Jesus in the Quran in the previous lecture, we're going to turn now to a detailed study of a passage that involves Jesus and also involves the disciples of Jesus. And this is sort of a case study for us. We're really going to focus in on one particular passage now in order to examine in detail the relationship between the Quran and the Bible, or better, the way that the Quran develops biblical narratives to advance its own particular, unique religious argument. The passage that concerns us is towards the end of the 5th surah of the Quran, chapter 5, this surah that we referred to a lot in the previous lecture, because indeed, surah 5 has a lot of material on Jesus and Christians. But here, this passage begins not with Jesus, but with the disciples of Jesus, who make a demand which seems to be impertinent of Jesus. Quran chapter 5, verse 112, we read, "And when the disciples said, 'O Jesus, son of Mary, is your Lord able to bring down for us a table from heaven?' He said, 'Fear God if you are believers.'" So here we have a passage in which the disciples make a curious demand of Jesus. Can your Lord, will your Lord bring down for us a table from heaven? Jesus seems to resist this, right? Because his response is, "Fear God if you are believers." He seems to be saying, just fear God. Don't make these sort of requests of God. Just be pious. That should be enough. But they insist, verse 113, "We wish to eat from it, so that our hearts may be reassured, and know that you have told us the truth, and be among those who witness it." And then in the following verse, Jesus makes the request of God, and God announces in the verse after that indeed he will bring down the table to the disciples. This is a fascinating passage. Where does the Quran get this tradition of Jesus calling down a table from heaven and of the disciples making the request for this table from heaven? There's nothing clearly like it in the New Testament or later Christian writings. But I think we can understand it in light of what we find in the Bible. That indeed has been the principal strategy of academic scholars examining this passage. They've asked themselves, what is the closest passage in the Bible to this passage in the Quran? And two passages have been at the center of their analyses. Let's look at them briefly. The first is the story of the multiplication of the fish and loaves that we find in the Gospels. The story that Jesus miraculously turned fish and loaves into many to feed a large crowd which had been gathered. The problem with this idea that the story of the multiplication of the fish and loaves could be behind the story of the table from heaven in the Quran is that in the story of the fish and loaves, it's not the disciples who approach Jesus and ask for a miracle. What they ask for, according to the gospel accounts, is for Jesus to send the crowds away. And it's Jesus himself who prays to God for the miracle. We read in Matthew 14:15 how they asked to send the crowds away. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." We might also note that in the gospel account, the food doesn't come down from heaven. Rather, it is Jesus who miraculously multiplies earthly food. Other scholars have said, well, let's look to another account in the New Testament. Let's look to the account of a sheet which comes down from heaven in this unique account in Acts chapter 10, which involves Peter. According to this account, Peter is up on the roof of a building in prayer when a sheet filled with animals comes down from heaven. We read in Acts chapter 10, verse 9, "The next day, as they were on their journey and coming near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, and he became hungry and desired something to eat. He fell into a trance." Verse 11 now, I'm moving quickly through this. "He saw the heaven open and something descending like a great sheet. In it," verse 12, "were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, 'Rise, Peter, kill and eat.' But Peter said, 'No, Lord, for I have never eaten anything which is uncommon, rather which is common or unclean.' And the voice came to him a second time, 'What God has cleansed, you must not call common.'" Here indeed the food comes from heaven. It seems to be something like this table from heaven that we read about in the Quran. The sheet, not a table, but a sheet comes from heaven with all sorts of food in it. But the fundamental literary skeleton or structure of this narrative is not like that which we find in the Quran. In the Quran, it's the disciples who make a demand. They want food from heaven. Here, Peter doesn't want food from heaven. He doesn't want to eat because the animals are unclean according to Jewish ritual law in this story that we find in Acts 10. So it seems to be quite different from what we actually find in the Quran with a table from heaven. So we need to look somewhere else. My idea, shared by one other scholar, a Belgian named Michel Kuipers, is that this passage in the Quran is connected to the bread of life discourse in John chapter 6, the Gospel of John chapter 6. Here Jesus compares himself with the manna. Remember the manna from the stories of the Israelites in the wilderness, this miraculous bread which comes down from heaven, in which they eat to sustain themselves, even though they're in a barren wasteland. Jesus in John 6 compares himself with the manna that God once sent down to the Israelites. In this passage in John 6, the crowds that are following Jesus come to him and they make a demand, much like the disciples in the Quran make a demand of Jesus. The crowds come and they demand a sign, much like the disciples in the Quran demand a sign from God. Here we read John 6, verse 30. So they said to him, "Then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat." And Jesus responds and declares, I'm skipping a verse here, verse 33, "For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." Skip one more verse to verse 35. Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I have said to you that you have seen me, and yet do not believe." Indeed, the scene is like what we find in Quran 5. Again, as I've mentioned, the crowds make a demand of Jesus for a sign, and Jesus promises that there will be food which comes from heaven. But what's particularly fascinating, and what suggests that there's a particular relationship here between Bible and Quran, in that there's a connection with Psalm 78. Psalm 78 reflects upon the experiences of the Israelites during their wanderings in the wilderness, and it condemns them for their various moments of infidelity towards God. At one point in Psalm 78, the psalmist writes, "They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God, saying, 'Can God spread a table in the wilderness?'" Indeed, the correspondence between this verse, Psalm 78, verse 19, and 5:112 is remarkable. The disciples in the Quran ask, "Is your Lord able to bring down for us a table from heaven?" While the Israelites in Psalm 78 ask, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness?" What's even more remarkable is that the Quranic word here for table, ma'idah, this is where Surah 5 gets its name, incidentally, is related to the Ethiopic word for table, which is ma'ed, and indeed, this is the word used in the Ethiopic Bible in Psalm 78:19. In other words, what you would read if you read the text in Ethiopic is, "Can God spread a ma'id in the wilderness?" Whereas if you read the Quran in Arabic, you read, "Is your Lord able to bring down for us a ma'idah from heaven?" They're very close, what we find in the Psalm and what we find in the Quran. Thus, the ma'idah episode seems to be a unique development of biblical material. The Quran has brought together something we find in the Psalms, a reference to the way that the Israelites demanded a table from heaven, a ma'id in Ethiopic, the Ethiopic language, and what we find in the bread of life discourse in John chapter 6. That is, it's taking this general theme of unbelieving followers that we find in the Psalms and shifted that, transposed that into the John 6 account, so that in the Quran what we find is it's not the Israelites, but the disciples who are making this demand of Jesus. Thus, the author of the Quran has not copied, but rather developed in a distinct way a story that we find in two different places in the Quran. We see some of the creative genius of the Quran here. And at the same time, we thus can appreciate the intimate and dynamic relationship between the Bible and the Quran.